Chapter 1. The Day Everything Ended. Stephen Harper had always believed that life followed a quiet rhythm. For more than 40 years, his days began the same way. He woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and walked the short distance to the small grocery store he had owned for most of his life. The store sat on the corner of Maple Street, a modest place with faded green paint and a wooden sign that had been hanging there longer than most of the customers could remember. Stephen liked things simple, orderly, predictable. At 68, he moved slower than he once had, but his routine never changed. Every morning he unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and breathed in the familiar smell of fresh bread, fruit crates, and old wooden shelves. It was the smell of a life he had built with his own hands. But that morning, 7 years ago, everything changed. Stephen had just finished stacking apples in the front display when the phone rang behind the counter. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:42 a.m. Who's calling this early? He muttered to himself. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked over to the phone. The bell kept ringing, sharp and impatient, echoing through the quiet store. Stephen picked it up. "Harper's Market," he said calmly. "This is Stephen speaking." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a serious voice spoke. "Mr. Harper? This is Officer Daniels from the County Police Department." Stephen straightened slightly. Police officers didn't usually call grocery stores at breakfast time. "Yes, this is Stephen Harper," he replied slowly. "Is something wrong?" Another pause. Stephen suddenly felt a strange chill creep down his spine. "Sir," the officer said gently, "there's been an accident involving your daughter, Willa Harper." The crate of oranges near Stephen's feet slipped from his hands and rolled across the floor. "My daughter," he whispered. His heart began pounding. "What kind of accident?" he asked quickly. The officer's voice grew quieter. "There was a car crash early this morning on Route 17. Stephen gripped the edge of the counter. No, that can't be right," he said under his breath. "Willa drives that road to work," the officer continued carefully. "The vehicle caught fire after the impact. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the fire was already too intense." Stephen's ears began ringing. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Harper." The words seemed to float in the air. "We believe your daughter did not survive." For a moment, Stephen could not breathe. The grocery store around him blurred. People moved outside on the sidewalk. A delivery truck rumbled past the window. Somewhere a car horn sounded. But inside the store, the world had gone silent. "You believe?" Stephen said faintly. "The fire was severe," the officer explained. "The body was badly burned. Identification will take time." Stephen's knees weakened. He grabbed a chair behind the counter and sat down slowly. "No," he murmured. His mind rejected the words immediately. Willa couldn't be dead. He had just spoken to her 2 days earlier. She had laughed about something Ivy did with finger paint. She had promised to visit the store on Sunday, like she always did. She couldn't be gone. "Mr. Harper?" the officer asked gently. Stephen swallowed hard. "I'm here," he managed to say. "We'll need you to come to the hospital to discuss the situation," the officer said. "And to speak with your son-in-law, Brad. He's already there." Brad. The name barely registered in Stephen's mind. I'll come," Stephen said. He hung up the phone slowly. The store suddenly felt enormous and empty. Stephen stared at the scattered oranges rolling across the floor. Then he whispered the words he couldn't believe. "My little girl." The next few days passed like a dream he couldn't wake from. Stephen barely remembered driving to the hospital. He remembered Brad sitting in a chair in the hallway, his face buried in his hands. He remembered doctors speaking softly, police officers explaining the accident, paperwork being placed in front of him. But most of it felt distant, unreal. At one point, Stephen asked the question that had been burning in his chest. "Can I see her?" The room fell quiet. The officer and doctor exchanged glances. Then the doctor spoke carefully. "I'm afraid the body was severely damaged by the fire." Stephen felt his stomach tighten. It would be very difficult and very upsetting to view her. "So I can't see my daughter?" Stephen asked quietly. The doctor hesitated. "We strongly advise against it." The words struck him like a hammer. Stephen lowered his eyes. "All right," he whispered. And just like that, he accepted something he had never truly seen. The funeral was held 3 days later. The church was full. Friends, neighbors, and longtime customers from Stephen's grocery store came to pay their respects. But Stephen barely noticed them. At the front of the church stood a closed wooden casket. He stared at it the entire service. Inside that box, they told him, was his daughter. But Stephen had never seen her. Not once. The pastor spoke about Willa's kindness, her laughter, the love she had for her daughter Ivy. Stephen heard every word, but none of it felt real. Beside him, his wife Gloria clutched a handkerchief tightly. She had not stopped crying since the phone call. When the service ended, people lined up to hug them and whisper condolences. "I'm so sorry. She was such a wonderful woman. Our prayers are with your family." Stephen nodded politely, but Gloria collapsed against him as the last guest left the church. "She's gone, Stephen," she sobbed. "She's really gone." Stephen held his wife tightly, but he couldn't find any words to comfort her, because deep inside, he felt the same emptiness. Life after the funeral became quiet. Too quiet. The house that once felt warm now felt hollow. Gloria stopped cooking. She stopped gardening. She stopped laughing. Every evening, she sat by the window, staring at the street. Sometimes Stephen heard her whispering Willa's name. Months passed, but the grief never faded. Then one cold winter morning, Gloria collapsed in the kitchen. The doctors said her heart had simply given out. But Stephen knew the truth. Grief had taken her too. Within a single year, Stephen had lost both his daughter and his wife. After Gloria's death, Stephen's world grew smaller. The only light left in his life was his granddaughter, little Ivy. She was only a baby when the accident happened, too young to remember her mother. Stephen visited her as often as he could. He brought toys, storybooks, stuffed animals. Each time she smiled at him, his broken heart healed just a little. Brad promised he would raise her well. "I'll take care of her, Stephen," he said one evening. "You don't have to worry." Stephen wanted to believe him. Still, he felt responsible. Ivy was his daughter's child, so he made a decision. Every year, he would send Brad $40,000 to help raise her. For Ivy's future, Stephen said when he wrote the first check. Brad accepted it gratefully, and every year after that, Stephen sent another. 7 years passed this way. Stephen believed he was helping his granddaughter survive the tragedy that had destroyed their family. But he had no idea the tragedy had only just begun. Chapter 2, The Whisper in the Park. Saturday afternoons had slowly become the most important part of Stephen Harper's week. For 6 days, he lived inside quiet routines, opening the grocery store early in the morning, greeting familiar customers, stocking shelves, and returning to a silent house each evening. But on Saturdays, the house felt alive again. Because Saturdays were Ivy's day. Stephen always picked her up just before lunch. Brad would open the door, usually looking distracted or tired, and Ivy would come running down the hallway with her small backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Grandpa," she would shout, throwing her arms around his waist. That hug always warmed something deep inside Stephen's chest. On this particular Saturday afternoon, the weather was perfect. The sky was bright blue with soft clouds drifting slowly overhead. A cool breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves with a soft, whispering sound. Stephen parked his old pickup truck near the entrance of Willow Creek Park. Ivy hopped out beside him, clutching the small stuffed rabbit she carried almost everywhere. "You ready for the swings?" Stephen asked, locking the truck door. Ivy nodded. "Yeah." They walked down the familiar path toward the playground. The park was busy with families enjoying the afternoon. Children ran across the grass chasing each other. Dogs barked excitedly near the walking trail, and somewhere in the distance a group of teenagers laughed loudly near the basketball court. Stephen always liked coming here. The sound of children playing made the world feel a little less lonely. When they reached the playground, Ivy ran straight toward the swing set. "Push me high, Grandpa," she called. Stephen chuckled. All right, but not too high." He helped her sit on one of the swings and gently push her forward. The chains creaked softly as Ivy swung through the air. Back and forth, back and forth. Her brown hair fluttered behind her with each movement. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. "So how's school going?" Stephen asked, giving her another push. "It's okay. Ivy said. You still like your teacher? Mrs. Collins? Yeah. She's nice. Stephen smiled. That's good. Ivy swung forward again, kicking her legs slightly to go higher. Stephen noticed she wasn't laughing the way she usually did. Normally, she would shout with excitement or ask him to push harder. But today she seemed quieter, thoughtful. Stephen pushed her again. Did you draw anything interesting this week? He asked. You used to bring me pictures from class. I did a tree, Ivy said. A tree? Yeah. What kind of tree? Just a regular tree. Stephen laughed softly. Well, that sounds like a very nice tree. Ivy didn't respond. Instead, she slowly dragged her shoes against the ground until the swing came to a stop. Stephen noticed something odd. She looked over her shoulder, then toward the playground entrance, then toward a bench nearby. Her small eyes moved carefully, like she was checking who might be watching them. Stephen frowned slightly. What's wrong? He asked. Nothing, Ivy said quickly. You sure? She nodded, but her fingers gripped the swing chains tightly. Stephen stepped closer. You seem a little quiet today. Ivy looked down at the dirt beneath her shoes. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she slowly climbed off the swing. Can we sit over there? She asked, pointing to a wooden bench under a large oak tree. Of course, Stephen said. They walked over together and sat down. Children continued playing around them, their voices echoing across the playground. Stephen waited patiently. Ivy swung her legs back and forth beneath the bench. Then she looked toward the path again. Stephen followed her gaze. Nothing unusual, just families walking dogs and a couple pushing a stroller. Still, Ivy seemed uneasy. Ivy, Stephen said gently, is something bothering you? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned a little closer to him. Then suddenly her small hand grabbed the sleeve of his jacket. The movement surprised him. Her grip was tight. Grandpa, she whispered. Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. Yes, Stephen asked softly. Ivy looked around again. Then she leaned closer to his ear. Her voice dropped even lower. Grandpa, please stop sending Dad money. Stephen blinked. What? He pulled back slightly so he could see her face. Ivy looked serious, more serious than a 7-year-old should ever look. What do you mean? Stephen asked. But before he could ask anything else, Ivy spoke again. Just follow him one day, she whispered. Stephen stared at her. You'll see. The words hung in the air between them. For a moment, Stephen didn't know how to respond. Follow him? Why would he need to follow Brad? Stephen forced a small laugh. Well, he said lightly, that's a strange thing to say. Ivy didn't smile. She just looked down at her shoes again. Did your dad say something about the money? Stephen asked gently. She shook her head. No, then why would you say that? Ivy hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stuffed rabbit she was holding. Then she shrugged. I don't know. Stephen studied her face. Children sometimes imagine strange things. Maybe she had overheard part of a conversation and misunderstood it. Maybe she had watched a movie or heard something at school. Kids could get funny ideas sometimes. He reached over and gently patted her shoulder. You don't have to worry about grown-up stuff, he said kindly. I'm just helping your dad take care of you. Ivy didn't respond. Instead, she slowly climbed off the bench. Can we go back to the swings? She asked. Sure, Stephen said. They walked back toward the playground. Stephen pushed her again for a while. This time she laughed a little, but something about her earlier words kept echoing in his mind. Stop sending Dad money. Just follow him one day. You'll see. Later that afternoon, Stephen dropped Ivy back at Brad's house. Brad opened the door and gave a quick nod. Thanks for bringing her back, he said. No problem, Stephen replied. Ivy hugged him before going inside. Bye, Grandpa. Bye, sweetheart. Stephen watched her disappear down the hallway. Then he got back in his truck and drove home. The sun had already begun setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Normally, after seeing Ivy, Stephen felt lighter. But tonight something felt different. Uneasy. After dinner, he sat in his living room chair with the television playing softly in the background. But he wasn't watching it. His mind kept returning to the park, to Ivy's whisper, to the fear he had seen in her eyes. Stephen tried to laugh it off, thinking it was a child's imagination. But the fear in Ivy's eyes was real. And that night, Stephen couldn't stop thinking about her words. Chapter 3. Doubts begin to grow. For the first few days after the visit to the park, Stephen Harper tried to ignore what Ivy had said. Children sometimes said strange things. They misunderstood adult conversations or let their imaginations run wild. Stephen had told himself that many times during the week that followed. Still, the words lingered in the back of his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. "Grandpa, please stop sending Dad money. Just follow him one day. You'll see." Stephen continued his normal routine. Every morning, he opened the grocery store before sunrise. The bell above the door rang as customers came in and out, buying bread, milk, and vegetables just like they had for decades. He smiled and greeted them the same way he always had. But something had changed. His mind drifted constantly. He found himself replaying Ivy's whisper over and over. On Wednesday afternoon, his neighbor Mrs. Turner came into the store to buy eggs. "Stephen, you're giving me the wrong change," she said kindly. Stephen blinked and looked down at the register. "Oh, sorry about that," he said quickly, correcting the mistake. Mrs. Turner studied him for a moment. "You look tired," she said. "Didn't sleep well," Stephen replied with a small smile. But the truth was, sleep had become difficult. At night, his quiet house felt heavier than usual. The old clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence, and every time he closed his eyes, Ivy's worried expression returned to him. Something about that moment in the park had felt different. Real. Stephen shook his head and tried to focus on his work. But 2 weeks later, something happened that made the uneasy feeling grow stronger. It was a Tuesday morning when the phone in the grocery store rang again. Stephen wiped his hands on a cloth and answered. "Harper's Market," he said. "Stephen, it's Brad." Stephen straightened slightly. "Brad," he replied. "How are you?" "I'm good," Brad said quickly. Too quickly. His voice sounded rushed. "Listen, I was just calling about the yearly payment," Brad continued. Stephen frowned slightly. The yearly payment. Every year, around the same time, Stephen sent Brad $40,000 to help raise Ivy. It was a promise he had made to himself after Willa died. But something fell off. Brad usually waited until the end of the month before bringing it up. This time he sounded impatient. "I was actually hoping you could send it soon," Brad said. Stephen leaned against the counter. "Soon," he repeated. "Yeah, just, some expenses came up." Stephen hesitated. "What kind of expenses?" There was a short pause on the phone. "Oh, just normal stuff," Brad replied. "School things, bills, you know how it is." Stephen nodded slowly, even though Brad couldn't see him. "How's Ivy doing?" Stephen asked. Another pause. "She's fine," Brad said. "Fine," Stephen repeated. "Yeah, she's good." Stephen waited, expecting Brad to say more. Usually when Stephen asked about Ivy, he liked hearing little details, how school was going, what she was learning, funny things she had said. But this time Brad stayed silent. Stephen finally spoke again. "How's she doing in school?" "Good." Stephen frowned. "Does she still like our class?" "Yeah, I think so." The answers were short, vague, almost distracted. "Well," Stephen said slowly, "I'll take care of the payment soon." "Great," Brad replied quickly. "Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate it." Then the call ended. Stephen slowly placed the phone back on the counter. Something about that conversation bothered him. It wasn't what Brad had said. It was how he had said it. Brad sounded nervous. Stephen tried to dismiss the thought, but the feeling lingered. Over the next week, he found himself thinking about the call more often than he wanted to admit. Then one evening, something else happened. Stephen had closed the grocery store early that night. The sky was turning orange as the sun dipped behind the buildings. Instead of driving straight home, he decided to take a longer route through town. He wasn't in a hurry. The streets were quiet, and the evening air felt cool through the open window of his truck. As he drove through a familiar neighborhood, he realized something. He was passing near Brad's house. Stephen hadn't planned it that way, but the street looked so familiar that he slowed the truck slightly. Brad's small house sat halfway down the block. The front yard was dimly lit by the fading sunlight. Stephen wasn't trying to spy on anyone. He was simply passing by. But as his truck rolled closer, he noticed movement near the front of the house. Brad was standing outside near the driveway, and he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him. Stephen instinctively slowed the truck even more. The woman had dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She wore a light jacket and jeans. At first, Stephen assumed she might be a neighbor, but the way they stood together caught his attention. They weren't standing like strangers. They stood close. Too close. Brad leaned toward her slightly as they talked. Then the woman laughed. Not a polite laugh. A comfortable one, like she had known him for a long time. Stephen's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He drove slowly past the house, trying not to stare. But in his side mirror, he saw something that made his stomach twist. Brad placed his hand gently on the woman's arm. The gesture was casual, familiar. Stephen continued driving down the street. For a moment, he considered turning the truck around, but he didn't. Instead, he drove home. The entire ride back, his mind replayed the scene over and over. Brad talking with the woman, the way they stood together, the way she laughed. Stephen pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for several minutes without turning off the engine. Something about the situation bothered him deeply. Brad had never mentioned dating anyone. Not once. In 7 years. Whenever Stephen asked how things were going, Brad always spoke about Ivy or work. He had never said there was someone else in his life. Yet the way he stood with that woman tonight suggested something very different. They didn't look like two people who had just met. They looked like people who had known each other for years. Stephen finally turned off the engine. The silence of the night surrounded him. He walked slowly into his house, but his thoughts refused to settle. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe the woman was a coworker. Maybe she was just a friend. Still, something about the moment didn't sit right with him. Later that night, Stephen sat in his living room staring at the phone on the table beside him. For a long time, he didn't move. Finally, he reached over and picked it up. There was one person he knew who might help him make sense of things. An old friend. A man who had spent most of his life noticing details others overlooked. A retired detective named Roger Stevens. The uneasiness growing inside, Stephen finally pushed him to call an old friend. A retired detective named Roger Stevens. Chapter 4, Opening the Urn. Stephen Harper had known Roger Stevens for nearly 30 years. They first met when Roger used to stop by the grocery store during his shifts as a detective. Back then, Roger was younger, sharper, and always carried the tired look of someone who spent too many nights chasing criminals through dark streets. Over time, the two men had become friends. Roger liked Stephen's quiet honesty, and Stephen respected Roger's ability to see things other people missed. Even after Roger retired from the police force, he still visited the store occasionally to buy coffee and talk about old times. That was why Stephen felt comfortable calling him that night. When Roger answered the phone, his voice sounded relaxed. "Stephen Harper," Roger said with a chuckle. "I was wondering when you'd call again." Stephen managed a faint smile. "Still reading my mind, Roger?" "Old habits," Roger replied. "What's going on?" Stephen hesitated for a moment. "I need some advice," he said quietly. Roger immediately noticed the seriousness in his tone. "That bad?" Stephen exhaled slowly. "Maybe. I'm not sure yet. Tell me." So Stephen explained everything. He told Roger about the afternoon at the park, about Ivy grabbing his sleeve, about her whisper, "Stop sending Dad money. Just follow him one day." Roger didn't interrupt while Stephen spoke. The retired detective simply listened, letting the silence fill the spaces between Stephen's words. When Stephen finished, Roger hummed thoughtfully. "Kids say strange things sometimes," Roger said carefully. "I know," Stephen replied. "But you don't think this is just a kid being imaginative?" Stephen shook his head, even though Roger couldn't see him. "It was the way she said it," he replied. "She looked scared." Roger was quiet again. "And then there's Brad," Stephen continued. "What about him?" Stephen described the phone call asking for the yearly payment earlier than usual. The rushed voice. The vague answers about Ivy. Then he told Roger about the evening he had driven past Brad's house. "And he was standing there with some woman," Stephen said. "Do you know who she was?" "No, neighbor maybe." Stephen sighed. "Maybe." Roger waited. "But," he prompted. "They didn't look like neighbors," Stephen said. "How so?" Stephen leaned back in his chair. They were standing close, laughing. He touched her arm. Roger didn't say anything for a moment. Finally he spoke. "You think Brad's hiding something?" "I don't know what to think," Stephen admitted. "Well," Roger said calmly, "there's one way to find out." Stephen straightened slightly. Watch him. Watch him. Quietly, Roger clarified. Nothing illegal. Just keep your eyes open. Stephen rubbed his forehead. I feel strange even thinking about it. You're worried about your granddaughter, Roger replied. There's nothing strange about that. Stephen nodded slowly. Let me know if you notice anything unusual, Roger added. Sometimes small details lead to bigger answers. All right, Stephen said. After they hung up, Stephen remained sitting in his chair for a long time. The living room was dim except for a small lamp beside the couch. Across the room, on a wooden shelf near the window, sat something he rarely looked at. A small, polished urn. It had been there for 7 years. 7 years without being touched. Stephen slowly turned his head toward it. Willa's urn. The container held the ashes of his daughter. At least, that was what he had always believed. Stephen stood up and walked slowly across the room. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his steps. For years, he had avoided looking too closely at the urn. Every time his eyes landed on it, the same pain returned. The memory of the phone call, the funeral, the empty feeling that had swallowed his life. He stopped in front of the shelf. The urn was simple and elegant, made of dark bronze with a smooth lid. Stephen reached out and ran his fingers lightly across its surface. Hello, sweetheart, he whispered softly. The words came out automatically, like they had many times before. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the conversation with Roger. Maybe it was Ivy's whisper. Or maybe it was simply the strange feeling that had been growing inside him for weeks. Whatever the reason, Stephen suddenly felt an urge he had never felt before. He wanted to open the urn. The thought startled him. For 7 years, he had never even considered it. But now the idea refused to leave his mind. Stephen stepped back. That's ridiculous, he muttered. Ashes were ashes. What would opening it change? Still, he looked at it again. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the trees, tapping softly against the window. Stephen walked back to his chair, but he couldn't relax. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, he stood up again. Just once, he murmured to himself. He returned to the shelf. This time his hand didn't hesitate. He picked up the urn carefully. It was heavier than he expected. Stephen carried it to the coffee table and sat down slowly. His heart beat faster than it should have. Don't be foolish, he whispered, but the strange feeling remained. He placed the urn gently on the table. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then he reached forward and placed his hand on the lid. The metal felt cool beneath his fingers. Stephen hesitated. Opening it felt almost like breaking a sacred rule. But the curiosity had grown too strong. Slowly, carefully, he twisted the lid. The metal gave a soft, scraping sound as it loosened. Stephen lifted the lid. For a moment, he didn't look inside. His chest tightened. Then he forced himself to glance down. And immediately his breath caught in his throat. Inside the urn were no ashes. Instead, he saw something dark and grainy. Stephen leaned closer. His eyes narrowed. The contents didn't look like cremated remains. They looked like coffee grounds, mixed with a reddish powder. Stephen dipped 2 fingers inside and rubbed the mixture gently. The scent hit him instantly. Coffee and cinnamon. Stephen pulled his hand back as if the urn had burned him. He stared down at the contents in disbelief. His hands started shaking. This couldn't be real. If these weren't ashes, then whose remains had they buried? And more importantly, was Willa really dead? Chapter 5, Watching Brad. Stephen Harper barely slept the night he opened the urn. The image of the dark mixture inside, it kept replaying in his mind. Coffee grounds. Cinnamon. The smell had been unmistakable. Not ashes. Not even close. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Stephen had already made up his mind. He picked up the phone and called Roger Stevens. Roger answered on the 3rd ring. Morning, Roger said. You're calling early. Stephen didn't bother with small talk. Roger, I opened Willa's urn. There was a pause on the line. You did? Roger asked. Yes. And Stephen swallowed. There weren't any ashes. Silence filled the phone for several seconds. What do you mean there weren't ashes? Roger asked slowly. Stephen took a deep breath. It was coffee grounds. And cinnamon. Another pause. Roger's voice came back quieter this time. You're sure? I touched it. I smelled it, Stephen replied. It's not cremated remains. Roger exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, that certainly changes things. Stephen leaned against the kitchen counter. What does it mean? He asked. Roger didn't answer immediately. It means, he said finally, someone gave you a fake urn. Stephen closed his eyes briefly. That's what I was afraid of. Did anyone besides Brad handle the funeral arrangements? Roger asked. No, Stephen said. Brad took care of everything. The paperwork, the cremation, the service, all of it. Roger let out a quiet whistle. Then I think we need to start paying closer attention to your son-in-law. Stephen felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What do you suggest? Roger's voice shifted into the calm, focused tone of the detective he used to be. We watch him. 2 days later, the surveillance began. Nothing fancy, no spy equipment or hidden cameras. Just two older men sitting quietly in cars and paying attention. Roger had insisted on patience. People reveal a lot when they think no one is watching, he told Stephen. Their first evening parked down the street from Brad's house was uneventful. The small neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights flickered on as the sun disappeared, casting soft yellow circles across the pavement. Stephen sat behind the wheel of his truck while Roger watched the house through a pair of binoculars. You sure about that urn? Roger asked casually. Stephen nodded. I wish I wasn't. Roger lowered the binoculars. Then let's see what your son-in-law is up to. For the first hour, nothing happened. Brad's house remained quiet. A television flickered through the front window. Then, around 8 o'clock, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A small gray sedan slowly pulled into Brad's driveway. Stephen leaned forward slightly. Someone's here. The driver stepped out. It was the woman Stephen had seen before. Even from a distance, Stephen recognized her. Dark hair, same light jacket. She walked confidently up the front steps and knocked once before letting herself inside. Roger raised his eyebrows. She's comfortable, he muttered. Stephen felt his chest tighten. How often do you think she comes here? Let's find out, Roger replied. Over the next several days, the pattern became clear. The woman visited Brad often. Sometimes she arrived in the evening and left a few hours later. Other times, her car stayed parked in the driveway overnight. One night, Stephen watched the lights inside Brad's house turn off just after midnight, while the woman's car remained outside. Roger glanced at him. That's not exactly casual, he said. Stephen didn't respond. Something about the situation felt wrong. Not just the relationship. The secrecy. Brad had never mentioned her. Not once. And yet she seemed to be part of his life constantly. Then, 4 nights later, something new happened. Roger and Stephen were again parked down the street when Brad's garage door slowly opened. Brad's car backed out. Roger checked his watch. 10:30, he said. That's late, Stephen replied. Brad drove down the street and turned toward the main road. Roger immediately straightened. Start the engine. Stephen did. Brad's car moved steadily through town, heading away from the residential neighborhoods. Roger leaned forward in his seat. Keep some distance, he advised. Stephen followed carefully, staying several cars behind. They drove for nearly 15 minutes. The familiar parts of town slowly disappeared. The streetlights became fewer. Buildings grew older and more industrial. Finally, Brad turned onto a narrow road lined with warehouses and storage facilities. Most of the buildings looked abandoned. Broken windows, faded signs, rusty metal doors. Brad slowed his car and pulled into a cracked parking lot beside one of the warehouses. Stephen parked his truck behind a stack of old shipping containers across the street. They watched as Brad stepped out of his car. What is this place? Stephen whispered. Roger studied the building. The structure was large and square, made of old brick with a rusted metal roof. Several windows were boarded up. Looks like an old storage facility, Roger said. Brad walked to the front door and unlocked it. The metal door creaked as he pulled it open. Then he stepped inside. The door closed behind him. Stephen stared at the building. How long do you think he'll stay? Roger shrugged. Let's find out. The two men waited in silence. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The industrial district around them was eerily quiet. Wind rattled loose pieces of metal somewhere in the distance. Stephen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What could he possibly be doing in there, he murmured. Roger kept his eyes fixed on the building. Patience. Another 20 minutes passed. Brad still hadn't come out. Stephen's nerves tightened with every passing minute. Then suddenly Roger raised a hand. Wait. Stephen froze. Did you hear that? Roger whispered. Stephen listened carefully. At first he heard nothing. Just the wind and the distant hum of traffic. Then it came again. A faint sound. A sob. Stephen's head snapped toward the warehouse. That sounded like a woman, Roger finished quietly. The sound came again. Soft crying. Stephen's heart began pounding. The sound was coming from inside the building. Roger slowly opened the truck door. Come on, he whispered. They stepped out carefully and moved closer to the warehouse, staying in the shadows. The crying grew slightly louder. Stephen's chest tightened. Someone was inside. Then a voice spoke. Weak, broken, barely louder than a whisper. I've been here for 7 years. Chapter 6, The Impossible Discovery. Stephen Harper didn't sleep at all that night. After hearing the crying voice inside the warehouse, he and Roger had quickly returned to the truck. Neither of them spoke for several minutes as Stephen drove away from the industrial district. The road ahead looked empty and dark, illuminated only by the truck's headlights. Stephen's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. You heard it too, right? He finally asked. Roger stared out the passenger window, his face serious. Yeah, he said quietly. A woman. Stephen's chest felt tight. And what she said? Roger nodded slowly. I've been here for 7 years. The words echoed in Stephen's mind like a distant alarm. Roger, Stephen said hesitantly. What if? He stopped himself. He didn't want to say the thought out loud. Roger turned toward him. What if what? Stephen swallowed. What if someone is being held there? Roger rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That's possible. Shouldn't we call the police? Stephen asked. Roger shook his head slightly. Not yet. Stephen glanced at him in surprise. Why not? Roger leaned back in his seat. Because right now we don't know what's actually going on, he explained. If we call the police without evidence, Brad could simply deny everything. But we heard someone inside. Hearing something and proving something are two different things, Roger said calmly. Stephen frowned. So what do we do? Roger looked thoughtful for a moment. Tomorrow we gather more information. The next morning, Stephen closed the grocery store earlier than usual. His mind had been elsewhere all day. Customers noticed he seemed distracted, but he brushed off their questions with a polite smile. By late afternoon, he drove across town to Roger's small house. Roger greeted him at the door holding 2 cups of coffee. You look terrible, Roger said. I feel terrible, Stephen replied. They sat down at the kitchen table. Stephen leaned forward immediately. What's the plan? Roger slid a small laptop across the table. I've been making a few calls, he said. To who? Old friends. Even though Roger was retired, he still had connections from his years in law enforcement. Most industrial areas have security cameras somewhere nearby, Roger explained. Private businesses, traffic cameras, storage facilities. Stephen nodded slowly. And the warehouse district has several, Roger continued. Roger opened a program on the laptop and typed quickly. After a moment, several grainy video feeds appeared on the screen. These cameras overlook the main road near that warehouse, Roger said. Stephen leaned closer. Can we see inside the building? No, Roger replied. But we can see the entrance and the surrounding street. Stephen's heart beat faster. Let's start reviewing. The process was slow and exhausting. Roger pulled up recordings from the previous several days. Hour after hour of footage played on the screen. Cars drove past. Delivery trucks came and went. Occasionally a pedestrian walked along the sidewalk. But nothing unusual appeared. Stephen rubbed his tired eyes. How long have we been watching? Roger glanced at the clock. 3 hours. Stephen sighed. Maybe we missed something. Maybe, Roger said. But he kept watching. Roger had spent decades studying surveillance footage. He had learned that patience often revealed what others overlooked. Finally, he paused one of the videos. Wait, he said. Stephen leaned forward. What is it? Roger rewound the footage a few seconds. A car appeared on the screen, slowly turning into the parking lot of the warehouse. Stephen immediately recognized it. That's Brad's car. Roger nodded. Let's watch carefully. They followed the footage as Brad parked outside the warehouse. Just like the night before, he stepped out unlocked the door, and went inside. Then the video continued. Several minutes passed. Nothing happened. Stephen frowned. "That's it. Hold on," Roger said. He fast-forwarded the footage. Another car appeared on the screen. This one was smaller, dark-colored. The vehicle parked near the far side of the building. Stephen leaned closer. "Who's that?" A woman stepped out of the car. At first the image was blurry. The camera angle was poor, and the lighting made it difficult to see clearly. The woman walked quickly toward the warehouse door. Her head was lowered. Stephen squinted. "Can you zoom in?" Roger clicked a few buttons. The image enlarged slightly, but it remained grainy. The woman reached the warehouse door. She looked around briefly. Then she stepped inside. Roger froze the frame. "Interesting," he murmured. Stephen stared at the screen. Something about the woman's posture felt strangely familiar. But the image was too unclear. "I can't see her face," Stephen said. Roger nodded. "Let's try enhancing it." Roger opened another program and began adjusting the video. The image slowly sharpened. The shadows softened. The contrast improved. Stephen's heartbeat quickened. The woman's face gradually became clearer. Roger stopped adjusting the image. "Let's see," he said quietly. Stephen leaned forward. At first, his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The face on the screen looked familiar. Too familiar. His heart skipped a beat. "Roger," he whispered. Roger said nothing. Stephen's hands began to tremble. "No," he murmured. He leaned even closer to the screen. The woman's face was now visible. Her eyes, her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. Stephen felt his breath leave his body. "It can't be." Roger slowly turned toward him. But Stephen barely noticed, because the woman on the screen was someone he knew better than anyone. The woman's face was unmistakable. It was Willa, his daughter, the daughter he had buried 7 years ago. Stephen felt the world collapse beneath him. For 7 years he had believed she was dead. For 7 years he had mourned her, but she had been alive the entire time. Chapter 7. The Warehouse. Stephen Harper stared at the laptop screen long after the video stopped moving. The image of the woman standing outside the warehouse remained frozen on the display. Her face was slightly blurred by the camera's grainy quality, but there was no mistaking it. It was Willa, his daughter. Stephen's heart pounded so loudly he could hear it echoing in his ears. This has to be wrong," he whispered. Roger Stevens sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the screen. The retired detective had spent decades studying faces, body language, and surveillance footage. But even he looked stunned. "Zoom in again," Stevens said quickly. "Maybe we're seeing it wrong." Roger adjusted the frame, sharpening the image as much as the software would allow. The face became slightly clearer. Not perfect, but clear enough. Stephen felt his chest tighten. The same eyes, the same shape of her nose, the same small scar near her eyebrow from when she had fallen off her bicycle at age 9. Stephen leaned back in his chair as if the screen had pushed him away. "Oh my God," he breathed. Roger closed the laptop slowly. "I don't think we're mistaken," he said quietly. Stephen stood up from the table and paced across the kitchen floor. "That's impossible," he muttered. "We buried her." Roger didn't respond. "We held a funeral," Stephen continued. "I watched them lower the casket into the ground." Roger finally spoke. "You never saw the body." Stephen stopped pacing. The words hit him like a brick. He remembered the doctor's voice at the hospital. The fire was too severe. It would be very difficult to view her. Stephen pressed his hands against the kitchen counter. "But why?" he asked. Roger shook his head. "I don't know yet." Stephen looked back toward the laptop. "Then there's only one way to find out." Roger raised an eyebrow. "You want to go there?" Stephen nodded immediately. "Tonight." Roger leaned back in his chair, studying him. "That could be dangerous." Stephen didn't hesitate. "That's my daughter." Roger sighed quietly. "Fair enough." The night air felt colder than usual as Stephen drove toward the warehouse district again. The streets were mostly empty. Stephen gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. Every memory of Willa flooded back to him. Her first day of school. The time she helped him repaint the grocery store sign. The day she introduced Brad as the man she wanted to marry. And then the phone call. The accident. The funeral. 7 years of grief. 7 years of believing she was gone forever. Roger sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the dark streets pass by. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked gently. Stephen didn't take his eyes off the road. "I've waited 7 years," he said. They reached the industrial district just before midnight. The area looked exactly the same as the previous night. Silent. Abandoned. Rows of old warehouses stood like sleeping giants under the dim glow of streetlights. Stephen parked the truck several buildings away. Neither man spoke as they stepped out. The wind whistled softly through broken metal fences. Roger gestured toward the warehouse. "Same one." Stephen nodded. They walked carefully through the shadows, their footsteps echoing softly against the cracked pavement. When they reached the warehouse door, Stephen noticed something. The metal lock was hanging open. Roger crouched down to examine it. "Recently used," he whispered. Stephen swallowed hard. "Do you think he's here?" Roger shook his head. "Brad's car isn't outside." Roger slowly pushed the door open. The hinges groaned loudly in the quiet night. Stephen stepped inside first. The warehouse interior was enormous. Rows of empty shelves stretched across the dusty floor. Old wooden pallets lay scattered in corners, and broken crates were stacked against the walls. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the roof, casting pale beams across the room. "Hello," Stephen called cautiously. His voice echoed through the empty space. No answer. They moved deeper into the building. Their footsteps stirred dust that had probably been sitting untouched for years. Stephen's heart raced. Then Roger suddenly raised his hand. "Look!" At the far end of the warehouse, behind a stack of tall shelves, a faint glow flickered. "Light!" Stephen and Roger moved closer. As they stepped around the shelves, the scene in front of them made Stephen freeze. A small corner of the warehouse had been turned into a makeshift living space. A narrow bed stood against the wall. A small wooden table sat nearby with a lamp on it. Several boxes were stacked neatly beside the bed. Clothes hung from a metal rack. Stephen stared in disbelief. "Someone's living here," he whispered. Roger nodded slowly. Then Stephen noticed something on the wall. Photographs. Dozens of them. He stepped closer. His heart tightened. Every photo showed the same person. Ivy. Pictures of her as a baby. Pictures of her playing at the park. Pictures of her starting school. Stephen felt his throat tighten. "Who put these here?" he whispered. Before Roger could answer, a soft sound came from the shadows behind them. Footsteps. Stephen turned slowly. A figure moved cautiously into the faint light. For a moment, Stephen couldn't breathe. The woman standing there looked thinner than he remembered. Her hair was longer, slightly tangled. Her face looked pale and tired. But the eyes were the same eyes he had seen since the day she was born. "Dad," the woman whispered. Stephen felt his knees weaken. "Willa." She took a step forward. Then another. Tears suddenly filled her eyes. "Dad, is that really you?" Stephen couldn't stop the tears running down his own face. "My God," he whispered. Willa covered her mouth as she stared at him. Then the tears burst free. She rushed forward and collapsed into his arms. Stephen held her tightly, afraid she might disappear if he let go. "You're alive," he murmured again and again. "I thought you were gone." Willa clung to him, shaking with sobs. For 7 years, she had believed she could never go home. Chapter 8. Willa's Terrible Secret. For several minutes inside the warehouse, no one spoke. Stephen Harper held his daughter tightly, as if he were afraid that letting go might cause her to vanish again. His arms trembled slightly around her thin shoulders. "Willa, my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're really here." Willa clung to him just as tightly. Her body shook with quiet sobs, and Stephen could feel how fragile she had become. Behind them, Roger Stephen stood silently, giving them a moment. Finally, Willa stepped back slightly and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her worn sweater. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said softly. Stephen studied her face. 7 years had changed her. There were faint lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her cheeks were thinner. Her hair, once neatly styled, now hung loosely around her shoulders. "You look tired," Stephen said gently. Willa gave a small, sad smile. "I am." Stephen glanced around the small, living space again. You've been living here this whole time? Willa nodded. Yes. Roger stepped forward slightly. You mind if I ask a few questions? He said calmly. Willa looked at him curiously. Roger, she asked. Roger smiled faintly. Still remember me? Of course, she said quietly. You used to come to Dad's store all the time. Roger nodded. That's right. Stephen gently guided Willa to sit on the small bed while he pulled up a wooden crate and sat across from her. Willa, he said softly, we need to understand what happened. She looked down at her hands. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. Then she took a deep breath. I never meant for any of this to happen, she said quietly. Stephen leaned forward. Start from the beginning. Willa nodded slowly. It was 7 years ago, she said. A few weeks before the accident everyone believes killed me. Her voice trembled slightly. My best friend Natalie came over that night. Stephen remembered the name immediately. Natalie Hughes. Willa and Natalie had been friends since high school. They had spent countless afternoons together growing up. What were you arguing about? Stephen asked. Willa swallowed. Money. Stephen frowned. Money. Willa nodded. Natalie had invested in a small business with me, she explained. A clothing boutique we wanted to open together. Roger folded his arms, listening carefully. But things weren't going well, Willa continued. The store was struggling. We were losing money. She stared at the floor as she spoke. Natalie accused me of hiding profits from her. Were you? Roger asked calmly. Willa shook her head quickly. No, I wasn't. So what happened? Stephen asked. Willa took another slow breath. We started arguing. Loudly. Things got heated. Her hands tightened together. She said she was going to report me for fraud if I didn't give her money back. Stephen frowned. That doesn't sound like Natalie. She was angry, Willa said softly. We both were. The warehouse seemed to grow quieter as she continued. She started shouting, accusing me of ruining her life. Willa closed her eyes briefly, remembering the moment. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop. What happened next? Roger asked gently. Willa hesitated. Then she spoke quietly. She grabbed my arm. Stephen leaned forward slightly. And I pushed her away. The words came out almost as a whisper. It wasn't hard, Willa continued quickly. I just wanted her to let go. Stephen felt his stomach tighten. Willa's voice shook as she continued. But she lost her balance. Roger's eyes narrowed slightly. She fell. Willa nodded. She fell backward and hit her head on the edge of the kitchen counter. Stephen inhaled sharply. The image formed clearly in his mind. What happened then? He asked softly. Willa's eyes filled with tears. She didn't move. Stephen felt a cold chill run through him. I called for Brad, Willa continued. He came running from the living room. Roger leaned slightly closer. What did he do? He checked her pulse, Willa said. Her voice trembled as she repeated the words she had heard that night. Then he looked at me and said, She's dead. Stephen's heart sank. You were sure? Roger asked. That's what Brad told me, Willa replied. The warehouse fell silent again. I panicked, Willa said quietly. I kept saying it was an accident. I didn't mean to push her. Stephen placed a hand gently on her shoulder. I know, he said. Willa wiped another tear from her face. Brad told me to calm down. Roger's voice was careful. What did he suggest? Willa hesitated before answering. He said if the police found out, I'd go to prison. Stephen felt anger rising inside him. You should have called the police anyway, he said. I know that now, Willa whispered. But that night, I was terrified. Roger nodded slightly. Fear makes people believe things they normally wouldn't. Willa continued slowly. Brad said he had a solution. Stephen frowned. What kind of solution? Willa looked up at him. He said we can make it look like I died. Stephen blinked in shock. What? He said if the police thought I was dead, they'd stop looking for me. Roger crossed his arms. And you believed him? Willa nodded weakly. I didn't know what else to do. Stephen rubbed his forehead in disbelief. So he staged the accident. Yes, Willa said. Her voice had grown quieter. He arranged a car crash. Roger's eyes sharpened. A burned vehicle? Willa nodded again. He said the fire would make identification impossible. Stephen felt his chest tighten as he remembered the hospital. The doctor explaining the fire damage. The closed casket. And the funeral? Stephen asked. Brad organized everything, Willa said. He told me to stay hidden while he handled it. Roger glanced around the warehouse. And he brought you here? Yes. Stephen stared at the small bed, the boxes of supplies, the photos of Ivy taped carefully to the wall. Brad told me I had to stay here, Willa continued softly. For a while. How long? Stephen asked. He said until everything cooled down. Stephen felt anger building inside him. And you believe the police were still looking for you? Willa nodded slowly. I thought if I left, they'd arrest me. She looked around the warehouse. So I stayed. Her voice cracked slightly. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. Willa stayed hidden because she believed the police were still searching for her. Chapter 9. The Real Truth. Even after Willa had explained everything, Stephen couldn't fully process it. The thought of his daughter living in a dark warehouse for 7 years, thinking she was a fugitive, was almost too much to bear. Yet, deep down, a small part of him wanted to believe Brad's plan had been meant to protect her. Roger Stevens, however, remained skeptical. I don't like it, Roger muttered as he leaned back in the chair at Stephen's kitchen table. Something isn't right. Stephen frowned. What do you mean? Roger tapped his fingers against the tabletop. Think about it, Stephen. 7 years, hiding in a warehouse? Why would Brad go through so much effort, moving her here and there, keeping her locked away, without the police noticing anything suspicious? Stephen hesitated. He said it was to keep her safe. Safe. Roger's voice rose slightly. If your daughter really had been involved in an accident that killed her friend and Brad staged it to protect her, why would he never let you or anyone else see her? Why make her live like a prisoner? Stephen swallowed hard. I don't know. Roger leaned forward, eyes narrowing. I think Brad lied, Stephen. And not just about hiding Willa. What are you saying? I'm saying there's more to this. Much more. Roger stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. We need to investigate Natalie Hughes. Stephen blinked. But she's supposed to be dead. Willa said she. Exactly, Roger interrupted. That's the problem. We're taking Willa's story at face value. But people lie, Stephen. And when someone profits from a lie, it's worth checking the truth. The next day, Roger began digging. He contacted old colleagues, ran background checks, and pulled public records. He checked hospitals, police reports, and even social media accounts. Stephen stayed close, pacing the living room nervously. Every so often, he would glance at Willa, sitting quietly on the couch, staring at her hands. Finally, late in the evening, Roger called Stephen into his study. Stephen, Roger said, his voice low, you need to see this. On the computer screen, a news article appeared. It showed a photograph of a woman, smiling at a cafe, holding a cup of coffee. The caption read, local business owner celebrates birthday with friends. Natalie Hughes turns 35 today. Stephen felt his knees go weak. No, that can't be. Roger nodded grimly. It is. Natalie Hughes is alive. She's been living freely for 7 years. All this time, Willa thought she had killed her. But Natalie, she never died. Stephen sank into a chair, shaking his head. But how? Roger gestured at the screen. Think about it. If Natalie is alive, then Brad lied to Willa. Brad staged the accident, told her Natalie was dead, and kept her locked away. Stephen's stomach turned. But why? Why would he do that? Roger leaned back, folding his arms. The $40,000 yearly payments. Stephen, Brad's been collecting your money for 7 years. That's nearly $300,000. Stephen's hands clenched into fists. He was using me. Roger's eyes were cold, analytical. He was using you, Stephen. And not just you. He manipulated Willa. He convinced her that she had killed her best friend, then imprisoned her in a warehouse under the pretense of protection. Also, he could collect money from you while living his life freely. Stephen's mind reeled. And Willa, she believed it all. Yes, Roger said quietly. And that's what made it so easy for him. Fear makes people do things they never thought they would. Brad weaponized that fear. Stephen ran his hands over his face, unable to speak. I sent him money every year to help Ivy, and he stole it. Roger leaned forward, voice low and steady. And he's still doing it. He probably has Natalie with him somewhere. They planned everything together. Brad and Natalie have been in a relationship this entire time, Stephen. And this, all of it was a con. Stephen felt bile rise in his throat. He thought of Willa, hiding in the warehouse, starving for freedom, believing she was guilty of a terrible crime. He thought of his own grief, the funeral, Gloria's death. Everything had been built on lies. I can't believe this, Stephen whispered. Roger rested a hand on his shoulder. Believe it, Stephen. The evidence is here. The video, the security cameras, Natalie alive, and the pattern of Brad's behavior. He orchestrated the entire thing. He's a manipulator, a liar, and a thief. Stephen's eyes burned with a mix of grief and anger. So Willa, all these years, she wasn't guilty of anything. She's been a prisoner in her own life, and Roger didn't interrupt. Stephen's voice rose. I trusted him. I believed him. I helped him. And he used my money. Roger's expression hardened. Exactly. That's why we need to act carefully. Right now, we know the truth. But you need to be calm. Willa's safety comes first. Once she's secure, we can confront Brad. Stephen sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. He stared at the floor, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. 7 years of grief, 7 years of fear, 7 years of deception, all orchestrated by the man he had trusted most. Finally, he looked at Roger. So, the whole story Willa told me, she was hiding, believing she had done something terrible. But the real criminals were Brad and Natalie all along. Roger nodded solemnly. Yes, they staged the accident, convinced Willa she had killed Natalie, then imprisoned her in the warehouse. Meanwhile, Brad collected the $40,000 every year from you. The entire plan was designed to steal your money. Stephen felt his chest tighten, his hands shaking so violently he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. And they've been living freely, he whispered. 7 years, all this time living freely. Roger leaned back, letting the words sink in. Yes, 7 years. And now we know the truth. Stephen looked up, eyes burning with a mix of rage and heartbreak. He had been deceived, betrayed. But at least now, he had the knowledge to act. For the first time in 7 years, he felt a flicker of determination through the grief. The web of lies was unraveling, and the people responsible would have to answer for it. He clenched his fists, voice quiet but firm. Roger, they're going to pay for this. Roger gave a small nod. Step by step, Stephen. But first, we keep Willa safe. Everything else comes after. Stephen took a deep breath, staring at the screen, showing Natalie's smiling face. The betrayal cut deep, sharper than he could have imagined. He thought of Ivy, of the money he had sent year after year, and of Willa locked in the warehouse. I can't believe I trusted him, Stephen murmured. I just can't believe it. Roger placed a steady hand on his shoulder. I know, but now we know the truth. Stephen exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. For 7 years, he had mourned his daughter, believing her dead. For 7 years, he had sent money to a man he trusted. And all the while, Brad and Natalie had been living their lie. Stephen felt anger, sorrow, and disbelief swirl together in a storm inside him. But finally, at last, the pieces had fallen into place. The truth could no longer be ignored. Brad and Natalie had orchestrated everything. They had staged the accident. They had manipulated Willa. They had imprisoned her. And they had stolen from Stephen for 7 long years. Chapter 10, The Escape Plan. Stephen Harper sat in the dimly lit study of his home, the weight of the past 7 years pressing down on him like a physical force. The security footage, the surveillance, Willa's heartbreaking story, and Roger's painstaking investigation had all come together, forming a picture more horrifying than Stephen had ever imagined. Brad and Natalie had orchestrated everything, not just the accident, but 7 years of lies, theft, and psychological manipulation. Roger Stevens, his old friend and retired detective, was hunched over the laptop, scrolling through bank statements and transfer records. Here it is, he said finally, his voice low but firm. Just as I suspected. Stephen leaned forward, squinting at the screen. What am I looking at? Roger pointed. A transfer. A large one. To an offshore account just a few days ago. Stephen felt his stomach drop. How much? Almost $200,000, Roger said. Exactly the kind of money Brad would want to vanish with, and Natalie too. They're planning to disappear probably tonight if they can. Stephen clenched his fists. So, after 7 years of manipulating us, they're going to run away with everything. My money, my daughter's life, everything. Roger nodded grimly. Exactly, but this time you're ready. Stephen rose from the chair, pacing the room. His mind raced, trying to process the emotions, anger, grief, and a sense of determination. 7 years of mourning, 7 years of sending money, 7 years of trusting Brad, and now he knew the truth. I won't let them escape, Stephen muttered. Roger finally stood and placed a hand on Stephen's shoulder. Calm down. We need a plan. Panic will get us nowhere. But with the information we have, we can stop them before they vanish. Stephen turned, his eyes fierce. Tell me what to do. Roger pulled up the ledger on the laptop. First, we alert the authorities. But carefully. If we tip them off too early, Brad and Natalie might go underground before the police can catch them. We need evidence, solid proof of the offshore account, and confirmation of their plans. Stephen nodded, feeling a spark of purpose ignite inside him. I'll do whatever it takes. Roger tapped a few keys, pulling up bank records and cross-referencing them with Brad's recent activities. See this? He said, pointing. Brad moved money from his local accounts to this offshore account. And look at the timestamps. He's been preparing for this for months, if not years. The transfers are just the final step. Stephen's eyes narrowed. And Willa, all these years, he kept her hidden so he wouldn't find out. So he could do this. Yes, Roger said. He needed control. If Willa knew, she might have spoken up sooner. If Stephen had questioned Brad more closely, the plan could have fallen apart. Everything was calculated. Stephen exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the desk. I can't believe I trusted him. I believed in him, and he used me. Roger nodded. It's hard to swallow, but now we have the advantage. We know the truth, and we know their plan. And most importantly, Willa and Ivy are safe with you. For the first time in 7 years, you have the upper hand. Stephen took a deep breath and looked at his daughter, sitting quietly in the corner of the study, her hands folded in her lap. She had grown thinner, hardened by years of isolation, yet there was a spark of hope in her eyes, a glimmer of the Willa he had known as a child. And beside her, little Ivy clutched her grandfather's jacket, wide-eyed and trusting. They can't hurt us anymore, Stephen said softly. Not after today. Roger smiled faintly. Exactly, but we move carefully. First, let's make sure we document everything. I'll make copies of the bank transfers, and we'll record their movements tonight if they attempt to leave. We'll present everything to the authorities. Stephen nodded, determination etched across his face. And I'll make sure Brad and Natalie face justice for what they did. For 7 years of lies, 7 years of pain, they won't escape. That evening, Stephen, Willa, and Roger set up a watch on Brad's house from a nearby vehicle. They kept to the shadows, the truck engine off, the street lights casting pale glows across the pavement. Every movement became magnified, the creak of a gate, the distant hum of a car engine, even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Hours passed. Brad did not appear, nor did Natalie. But the offshore transfer and the pattern of their past behavior told Roger and Stephen they were preparing to leave. Finally, Stephen whispered, "This is it. Tonight." Roger nodded. "Yes. They may try to escape under cover of night, but we're ready." Stephen's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through him. He glanced at Willa, who reached out to hold his hand. "Dad, thank you," she whispered. "You're coming home," Stephen said softly. "I promise. No more hiding. No more lies." Roger adjusted the laptop on the dashboard, running a final check on the bank transfers. "Everything is documented," he said. "If they leave, we have proof. If they try to deny it, we have the evidence to stop them." Stephen exhaled slowly, centering himself. 7 years of grief had brought him to this moment. 7 years of deception were about to be undone. The wind whispered outside the truck, carrying the faint scent of the industrial district. For 7 years, Stephen had been powerless, trusting the wrong man, mourning a daughter he thought he had lost. But now, armed with truth, evidence, and determination, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at Willa and Ivy once more. "No one will hurt our family again," he said firmly. "Not Brad. Not Natalie. Not anyone." Roger glanced at him, nodding in approval. "We move carefully, Stephen, step by step. But make no mistake, justice is coming." Stephen's jaw tightened. After 7 years, it finally will. He thought about the urn, the fake ashes, the stolen money, and the years Willa had spent trapped in fear. A storm of anger, sorrow, and relief swirled within him. But above all, a steely resolve emerged. He would not allow Brad and Natalie to disappear. Not now, not ever. Minutes passed in tense silence. Every shadow of the street seemed alive with possibility. Every flicker of light might be Brad or Natalie. But Stephen remained focused, his eyes scanning the area, every muscle coiled and ready. Roger finally whispered, "They'll be coming soon. We just need to wait and be ready." Stephen nodded, his grip on Willa's hand tightening. He could feel her trembling slightly, but it was no longer fear, it was anticipation, hope, the first feeling of safety in 7 years. "I promised Ivy," Stephen said softly, glancing at his granddaughter's wide eyes. "No one will take her away from us. Not now. Not ever." Roger's hand rested on the laptop, his finger hovering over the keys to call law enforcement if needed. "Then let's make sure that promise is kept." Stephen's gaze hardened, the fire of a man who had endured unimaginable betrayal burning in his eyes. 7 years of lies. 7 years of stolen trust and stolen time. Brad and Natalie would not escape. Not this time. And as he watched his daughter and granddaughter, safe and alive beside him, Stephen felt a quiet, powerful certainty settle in his heart. After 7 years of deception, justice was finally coming.